Hi, I'm Holly, I'm a writer, and I have always received one very consistent piece of feedback throughout basically my entire life. And that's that I have a very clear writing voice. Now, I don't know specifically how it is that I got to having this voice. I've never struggled to find it except for when I'm not feeling like myself. And so it isn't something that I necessarily know how to be like, and this is exactly how you get your writing voice. But I have some thoughts on it as somebody who hasn't struggled and who sees a lot of people struggling to find one that I thought I might share in the hopes of maybe one of them ringing true for like you if you are trying to find your writing voice. And also just generally like give a bit of insight into how I go about writing as somebody who doesn't have to think about my writing voice, because maybe you're overthinking it, maybe it's literally as simple as just being like, oh, okay. So the first thing I want to talk about, the only real like point I guess that I have, is about reading. Now, I have spoken about this so many times. I think that it's such an important part of reading. Also, I have a cold, so I'm sorry, my nose is really itchy. It's one of my like allergy things usually, but basically, I think in general that a writer should read widely because, I spoke about this with, I have a series where I'm talking about how to create a novel from start to finish. And I think part of like coming up with ideas that are original and, having like a plot that isn't very basic is to read as many books of as many genres and by as many authors and time periods as you can. Because when you think about, like the first story that a lot of people like to write when they're like fantasy people, especially, is like the classic hero's journey of like a child who finds out that they're special somehow and they go on a journey with like an old wizardy type person and they save the world. Very generic idea, and depending on how it's actually portrayed, it's not gonna be something that makes people go, wow, because it can be very, very overdone, shall we say. And the same is, in my opinion, true of the writing voice. And so, a way that I want to explain this, because I feel like it can sound like I may be coming from a position of like attack, I'm not. If you were English and you moved to America, chances are, living in America, you're gonna start saying things like sweater and candy and like parking lot or whatever, right? Like you're gonna start using the American version of the things that you have always said, like a different word for them. When that's true, it isn't always something that we notice. For me, it's something that I do notice. I do notice when I'm emulating the way that my friends speak. When I pick up a slang word that I wouldn't usually wear. Like, it's not in my vocab, but they use it, so I use it. I know as a writer that I am influenced a lot by the modern classic writers, by modern writers into the contemporary space, that I have a more simplistic, sometimes very bare way of writing in my description and in the way that I sort of set up my plots, but they're based off of like the emotional impact of these things, and they're based off of, an example that I would use is that in the first chapter of my first book, one of the opening lines is about how this character is signing autographs with a pen that was given to her by the team in a specific shade of purple that matches the team's branding. That's not a huge thing, right? It's a very small detail, but it tells you very quickly, like, oh, this team is serious. Like, they care so much about their image that they dictate which pens these employees use to sign autographs. Like, autographs because people like them as a person, as much as because of the actual company. it gives an image, especially when contrasted with the way that the main character sees herself and how she doesn't necessarily give herself a chance. And she's really afraid that she's messing it up and that she is gonna get kicked out of this job. It makes a lot of sense when you put it together, and it's a very small detail, but it's one that kind of works with this image of the team as a whole. And if you're really thinking about it, you get it. And so it's a small detail that has a lot of impact behind it, a lot of connotations to it. There are a lot of writers that I love who do stuff like that. And I'm not saying that I'm like in league with them. I'm not saying that I pull it off necessarily. I hope that I do, at least in my own way. But I think that that's important, right? To understand that you have influences. And the reason why this is so important is because while I have influences, I don't think that you read my work and immediately are like, oh, this reminds me of this person. Like, maybe if you knew that I was influenced by them, then you would. But otherwise, I don't think you would necessarily pick it up on your own. And that's important. That is very, very important. Because if you're struggling to find your voice, chances are you feel like your voice is too similar to the writers that you like, maybe. And that's, that's what I'm getting at, is that maybe it's because you're not reading enough. And again, hear me out. I'm going to just have some water though, because this, having a cold is like the worst thing ever. Okay, so I think, let's say with romance, okay, very popular genre right now online, chances are that there's going to be at least one romance writer who sees this. If you read only romance books, and you read only the kind of romance books that you like, let's say Emily Henry, maybe you chase other books down by writers who have a similar style to Emily Henry. I feel like you probably get where I'm going with this. There's like a chance that in reading the same kind of style over and over again, you are doing the same thing as being surrounded by other people speaking in a certain way, and therefore your speech changes to be like that. And that's not to say that you're outright copying them, because there's a lot more in that. But if you feel that your style of writing, your voice, isn't super unique, it could literally just be that you've read so many books that are reminiscent of this author that you admire, because you are seeking out books that remind you of this in hopes of finding books that you will love. And therefore your writing has started to emulate that, and you recognize that it's not original, and you recognize that it's not necessarily just your voice, and that it's like very much their voice. And I think that's fine. I think that, influences are fine, and if your style is similar, clearly there's going to be people who want to read your book because it's similar to that book. What the problem is that if that's not what you want, you're going to have to push a little bit. I might do honestly like a shelf tour at some point on here and talk about like my favourite books, but like being very broad rather than just like my all-time favourites, because I read classics, I read contemporary, I read thriller, I read horror, I read a little bit of fantasy, I read a little bit of this or that, blah blah blah. My interests are very varied, and I feel like when I read a book that is similar to an idea that I have, I think about it as I'm reading it, because I know that like this is kind of how I want it to be. This is like, I want it to unfold like this, and you don't necessarily feel like a rush to get to the end, but then when you get there, it's like everything hits you all at once because it's been building slowly. Or maybe it's like the bell jar, where it goes from one thing to the next and it just keeps going and going and going, and then there's a release of pressure, and it's like, oh, I feel like there's different sort of ways of going about storytelling, and when I'm reading a book that I'm enjoying, I think, this is how I want this one of my books to be, this is how I want this one of my books to be. Because it's very difficult sometimes to write something that you've never written before and to know how to go about it, and then you read something and it inspires you. And the reason why I think that this is so important is because frankly, you cannot be ever original, okay? I'm sorry to break that to you. We are thousands of years deep into society being tracked by things like literature in actual writing, and there is just no way that you would ever be able to be fully original. And that's not an insult, okay? All that it means is that you have to be aware that you're not original and use that to your advantage. You have to take, you know, this like similarity to this author that you really love and lean into it. With me, I know that I'm writing in a way that reminds me of these people, but because I'm not really thinking about that and I'm not really getting self-conscious about it, it comes out more like me. Because, okay, to go back to the example of like learning somebody else's like slang words, it might feel when you first hear them like that's a really weird word. I don't know what that means. You learn about what it means and then you're like, oh, okay. And then you start getting used to it, and then eventually maybe you say it without even thinking about it. It could be even just that you like have been reading a book where you keep seeing like a specific word that you had never encountered before, and then eventually it comes to a point where you just naturally use it in conversation or in your writing. That is always really fun, I think. It's fun to see a word and to be like, I have never seen anybody use that. And to actually come out with it, you kind of sometimes stop and go, whoa, I can't believe I just did that, like without even thinking about it. Like I didn't even have to try and do that. That just happened. That's your voice. That is your voice. If it comes naturally and you're not thinking about it and then you look at it and you're like, okay, that's your voice. And it's because you're not thinking about it, which is my second point, okay? Second thing that I want to talk about, try not to overthink it. You aren't going to be writing in a way that's natural if you're not really being natural with yourself. If you're trying to force the way that you speak in your, like, you know, in your writing, the way that you're, you know, people are probably gonna know. And I say people, you're gonna know. You're gonna read it and you're gonna be like, what? Something that you could do is you could try writing but like by dictating it, so you say it out loud and then you could just record yourself. Depending, obviously sometimes like a device doesn't know what you're saying because it just doesn't get your like dialect or whatever, that's fine, but you could just record yourself saying it and then, you know, transcript, and then basically as you're doing that you get this sense of like how it feels right for you to say things. So for me, and to sort of merge these 2 points, right? I know that there are books that have influenced me, but a lot of the time it's in the, as I said, the simplicity. It's in the idea that a book can be very powerful, but without having to be what a lot of people would consider to be beautiful nowadays. It's very popular for there to be like purple prose in novels, very flowery stuff. People love that. I think they think that it makes something sound smarter, and I'm not saying that that isn't sometimes true, but I think that there's an assumption that writing like that sounds better than other kinds of writing. And the simpler writing is the kind of writing that I prefer. It's the kind of writing that I felt so intimidated by classics because of some of the classics that I tried to read where I was like, this sucks. And then I've read like the better ones that I've read, in my opinion, and they're not like that. It doesn't matter how old they are, they're just not like that. And I'm able to get out of them the stuff that other people get out of the more flowery stuff. When you admire something, you want to use that. You want to be more simple, you want to be more flowery. But that doesn't mean that you have to actually use the same sort of sentence structure that they use to do that. It doesn't mean that you have to have your same plot points in the same section of the book. You can like somebody's style without copying what they do, and I think if you're reading the same thing over and over again, even if it's a different author, even if it's like just like a slightly different thing that has like a similar vibe, try branching out. Branch out, and while you're reading a different book, like literally if you're a romance reader, read something like crime or a sort of pure like non-romantasy, a fantasy, and take from that the things that you like about it. Don't just take, you know, the descriptions of places and think, well, that's nice. Think about the way that the words are used. How sparingly are the adjectives used? Do they have a lot of like speech that is sort of almost like a soliloquy, you know, like a long, very monologue-esque sort of thing? Because like at the moment, that's what I'm kind of doing. And my book is literary, which is why I'm doing that. I've never really done that before. You know, even in the chapters where my character wouldn't really speak for a long time because she would be driving a car and not speaking, there was a lot of like her thoughts, the way that she's feeling, the way that like there's action going on around her. It was very exterior as much as it was interior. This is very interior. I'm adding in things to remind you that she is in a physical place and that she's doing things. But it's also very much just like, you know, a character exploration. It's like a study of this character. I think that, you know, sometimes you read books like that and you think, I wouldn't usually enjoy something like that, but that did it really well. Why? Think about why. Think about the why this worked for you, why it didn't work. That's how you figure out what you like in books, and that's how you figure out how to do that yourself, but without directly copying another person's style and exact way of writing a book. My mouth. But yeah, I think that like, you know, Ayn Rand is one that I really agree with. Her like writing style, it gets along with me very well in my brain. Sorry, 1 second. I think that basically what I'm trying to say is that Ayn Rand is somebody whose books I really like. I like how they describe the passions of the characters in a way that makes the passions just like you feel their passion for this thing that they care about. Even it's literally like stuff that most people would not think about in their lives, right? And you think about it in the way that these characters think about it because you're reading it, you know? And it's brilliant. And you're just like, whoa. And on the other hand, you know, the way that she described, like, for example, the people that she doesn't agree with, like the characters that are objectively, you know, the ones that are supposed to come off as lesser because of the way that their insides are, you know, the way that their minds are, the way that they're kind of like unenlightened, right, in the context of her books. It feels a lot more stale, a lot more sort of stationary, and like they're not really making progress even when they seem to be making progress. Whereas the character whose career is a failure maybe, and by a lot of people's standards, you know, they would be like, oh, you should be ashamed. They're really proud because they've stuck to who they are, and you feel that. And again, the thing with it is like you don't always have to agree with a person's philosophy or with an author themselves to understand, you know, the way that they're writing these characters and to feel that, because that's what good writing is. It's about being powerful in the way that you describe some things and being purposefully weak in the way you describe others. Not that the writing itself is weak, but that the way you go about it is intentionally, you know, highlighting some things and putting other things down. I think that that's really fun. I think it's great that we can do that with work like this. I think that there's something special about it. And I think that when you sort of engage with a lot of different writers who go about these things in different ways, you really figure out the way that you want to do it. You don't just figure out what works in terms of what sells, you figure out what you like and what you don't. And you know, it's this thing of when you stop forcing yourself to use words that don't feel natural. You stop forcing yourself to try and write characters who are like funny, or, you know, they're like really like whatever, you know? Like, if you have a specific sort of vibe that you like in one person's work, but it doesn't feel right, don't do it. Because eventually, chances are, you will write something that you like from a different person's work. It's about mixing and matching, basically. It's about figuring out what works for you specifically and what doesn't, and about knowing why that works for you and why it doesn't. Because when you know that, you know who you are as a writer, and when you know who you are as a writer, your voice is going to feel more natural, and when it feels more natural, you're going to stop looking at it and being like, that doesn't feel right. What I think I'm going to do, actually, is just... Okay, something that I've just done is gotten up some of my work, because I want to talk... This is rough draft, okay? I'm kind of hating this. And I think that this is probably why it's such a good way of talking about voice, because even though I hate it, I'm still writing it. And what that means is that I get into it even though I'm hating it and I'm like, oh, this sucks. And I just do it. I'm not trying to be good because I don't think that it is good. You know, and I can fix that later. But what matters is that there's like my touch on this, right? So what I'm doing is something that I like to do that some people hate, is to start sentences with and or but. I think that it's really nice to sort of end a sentence and then continue it. Some people hate that. I do try not to do it, but in a first draft it comes out more because I'm not really caring about that right now. I'm like, do you know what? I can fix it later. So for example, this one, long before the album was even conceptualized, she had performed a less clean version, talking about her experiences living out in the woods, how every day she woke up to a beautiful sunrise and the mossy breath of trees, and how she would find roadkill, the dropped carcasses of small animals on her porch, or the stench of leaves left too long to rot. The balance had struck her back when her talent for writing was being born. She had sung the song for years, trying to make it work and unable to figure out how. A heavy-handed message for a girl too young to really understand it. And then it goes into something that is not necessarily a spoiler, but it's kind of a spoiler, I guess. So I'm not going to say that. But it goes into saying, now she sings for people a version wrapped in a metaphor, talking of how soft and sweet the petals of a rose look before they turn brown and shriveled, before they're plucked and discarded or shredded by whatever animal is stupid enough to eat them. And it's basically like, this is the song that the album and the sort of actual novel is named after, right? I came up with the song name before I came up with the album, and before I came up with this, like, the whole just the novel. Like, I have spoken before, I think. Have I spoken about the names of my books and like where it comes from? I don't know if I have. There's still some books that I have that I don't have a name for, but this one was really quick because when I was planning it, I created a few songs, one of which was the song that this is talking about. And I was writing like a blurb to get like a grip with what the story was going to be and like the vibe of it, because I always think that it helps to write like a blurb as if you're writing like a query letter or something, which I also did actually. And it took literally like 2 drafts for that query letter to be basically perfect. And I'm aiming to make the book as good as the query letter makes it sound, because it like the vision is so clear in that letter. In this song specifically, the message of the whole book is basically there. And so she says it, right? And that's the point. You're supposed to know. This is kind of like the thesis. You're supposed to sort of say the point of the book and like what is going on with the book, whether or not the character realizes it. And in this case, she does. She wrote this song based off of like a very specific experience, and like a time in her life, and like she went from, as she says, not quite knowing how to do it to getting it right. And you've got the dichotomy even in this paragraph of talking about the beauty and then death and rot. And that is like the point, right? Is that the book, it's a very beautiful book in like the visuals, but then there's this other stuff going on. There's the sweat underneath her beautiful dress because she's so like shaky and horrified by, you know, this thing that she won't talk about and that she can't talk about and that she refuses to talk about, and that's not a problem and it's not her fault and nothing's her fault. And it's just really fun. But it's like, it's supposed to be there, right? Because you're supposed to get the idea very quickly that this song, that all of her songs, but especially this one, this is the one that she is most aware of how it maybe was a mistake that she wrote it and performed it and then it became so popular because it maybe is a bit too personal, right? And so this experience, like, this is a first draft, right? Obviously, you cannot judge a first draft. Just gonna say that now. You can't judge a first draft. Like, you just can't do it. Not even your own, okay? You can't do it. I'm judging this one pretty hard, but I'm refusing to let that stop me from writing it because I know that I shouldn't be. It's like a worry that I can't write literary fiction, I think, more than like that the writing itself is objectively bad. Like, I'm not sure how the plot is moving, but it doesn't matter. And you shouldn't be. And I think that's another part of this, right? If you, this is why like the whole thing in my mind comes down to reading enough of like non-books that you are usually using. Like, you can't just read the specific type of book that you love, like to bits, right? You can't just read that because it's like, well, I want to write a book like that. You can't just read that book. You've got to read other books. You've got to read different styles of writing, and you've got to read different authors with very different styles than this. Even if you hate it, why do you hate it? That is valuable. And the reason why that's so important is because you have to be able to understand as well. Those are full, like, you know, edited and proofread and like edited again and edited again and again and again and then proofread again. And like the process of being a writer who writes a book and then gets an agent and traditionally publishes it, it's very long. It is years of work on this one book, years, a team of people working on it. It is like round after round after round. Even after the person who wrote it thought that it was the best that they could make it, it gets improved upon. And then it gets improved upon again and again and again. And so you cannot judge yourself by that writing and say, well, my writing's not as good. My voice is just like a worse version of this. Which is why I'm saying to kind of take a step back. Is this book the best that it's ever been? No. Honestly, it was pretty solid before I got to like chapter 2, and then I kind of lost the plot a little bit, literally. But I feel like this paragraph is a pretty good one to judge my voice off of, right? Because it's very raw. I felt really ironic when I wrote a heavy-handed message for a girl too young to really understand it. It feels heavy-handed to me, this whole paragraph. The whole book feels heavy-handed. It feels like I'm going, hey. But that's how it should be for a first draft. And if your natural voice leads you to writing how every day she woke up to a beautiful sunrise and the mossy breath of trees, and how she would find roadkill, the dropped carcasses of small animals on her porch, or the stench of leaves left too long to rot, you know? That sort of thing is the thing where you could eventually cut out a bunch of lines and just leave the image. And that's your voice. Not the version of it that sounds really bad because it's a first draft. That is also your voice, but it's not the voice that, like, you know, Emily Henry, for example, I'm sure that there are drafts of her books before they get edited where you would read them and you'd be like, this is quite weak. And then she's going to edit them and she's going to highlight the things that are good and discard or improve the things that are bad. And so I think that when it comes to voice, I'm trying to rest my arm on if this is like not working. I think when it comes to voice, basically what I want to say on it is just that your voice is inside of you, but sometimes you are the one you're presenting yourself in this way that is not who you are, because you think that that's what you have to do, because you think that you have to be perfect. The first thing that you write, like the first draft, has to sound like it could be published. Doesn't. It really doesn't. The whole of this, I know that I'm gonna fix it. I don't know how yet, but when I have the full picture, I will. And I know that because I'm me. And I know that I have had books that have changed completely from one draft to the next, from the second draft to the third. From draft 4 to 5, I think, of Formation Lab was the big one. I have books that I've read that I know the backstory of them, and I know that they also changed, and I love those books, and it's you know what, I probably would have liked that version, but this is I get it, this is perfect. I think that when you have a rough draft, it's very easy to think that it sounds not very good and that your voice isn't very clear. If it's the first book you've ever written, you're still finding yourself as a writer. I don't know what to say about that. You are kind of rushing it, maybe. Okay? You're putting so much pressure on yourself to be like these people. You're not engaging with stuff that isn't those people. You're not getting the experience necessary to really nurture that sort of part of yourself, and you're not giving it the time to be nurtured. You're not allowing yourself to just write rubbish. You're agonizing over every sentence to the point that, when you think about it, okay? Again, we're going to give a little analogy. Let's say that you're trying to write a message to somebody that you're not very happy with, and you're trying to sound not that angry and a little bit understanding, but really you're trying to also be hey, this needs to not be like this anymore. You might rewrite that about 500 times because you're that doesn't sound right, that doesn't sound right, that doesn't sound right. And then the version that you send is so clinical and it doesn't sound like you at all. And it just makes them obviously aware of how annoyed you are, because there is no way that a person who isn't annoyed would send a message with that very precise level of punctuation and word choice. And the sentence structure, you've been going in and cutting and pasting lines. They're gonna know, and you're gonna know. If you spend an hour writing 500 words, not because you're a slow writer, but because you specifically are choosing to edit as you go, and you're no, that doesn't sound like the right word to use, that doesn't sound right. How would this person do it? I feel this sounds too much like this person. Stop thinking about it. Because the more that you think, the less it's you're basically doing that same thing of making it so carefully, such a small piece, so carefully done, that it just comes across as being so fake, and you're very obviously not naturally saying that stuff. That's not from the heart. And you will know. And that's probably part of what's throwing you off. And again, I don't know your specific circumstances. I don't know. I don't know, okay? I don't know what it's like to struggle with voice. What I do know is that when my voice is off, it's usually because I'm not being myself. My brain isn't working as fast as it usually does. Right now, I feel so rubbish. And I last night, right, I came up with an idea for a book, and I have been dancing around it for a while because it's this one specific scene from Sabrina Carpenter's Man-Child music video that I have seen like a bunch, right, since the day that that video came out. And I've mentioned in my other videos that it was a picture of Sabrina Carpenter that like basically like flashed an image of a book in my head. And I was like, I have to write this. And I am. And again, I'm documenting the entire process. If you're new to this and you're worried, I'm documenting it, and I've talked about outlining, I've talked about writing the first chapter and like how I do that and how I try to like do it and how I take the pressure off of it, because I love writing a first line, I can't lie, I think it's really fun. But I think that this like specific scene, it reminds me of like a film that I've seen and that I loved the vibes of more than I loved the actual sort of film. And I was really sad because I didn't love the film as much as I love the vibes. It reminds me therefore of a bunch of films that I've seen. But I was like, I don't want to just write a film which is like a romance in this sort of vibe. I want to do something like I'm doing with this other book that I'm writing, and which will put it in the same vein as these like 3 books that I therefore would have, because I've got 2 books and I call them my books about women going through mental health, like successful women with mental health worries. And my other books also fit into that, my Formation Lab ones, like that world. So it makes sense that I would focus on it now, right? And I get to develop it, yay me. But specifically, something with that is that it wouldn't feel like me if I tried to just write a romance that was kind of like set in this sort of vibe. What does feel very me is if I wrote about 2 actors who were actually dating and they were acting in a romantic comedy. And it was with that vibe, but they're in a different time period. And they have like stuff going on that I can write about that isn't just like a fluffy romantic comedy set in this. So like you get the vibes, but it's also got that vein of like me in it, you know? Like you dig into it and you're like, oh yeah, that's obviously like, that's a classic Holly sort of plot. I think that that's what you need to do sometimes, is in general with your writing, you just need to go, how would I do this? Not how would I do that, and like not think about it. I was like, I don't know if I want to do that, but so if you have like a way of writing and you just do it like a stream of consciousness writing and you do it as quickly as possible, that's going to be closer to you than if you agonize over it. And then you can acknowledge that, you know, when you've seen like an example of how you write, you can take that on board rather than like absorbing all of the other people's writing that you're, you know, trying to be as good as them and like have other people who like them like you. You can just take your own writing and keep writing like that. And it's really difficult to talk about this because it's one of those things that you can't really force. It's like, I feel this all the time where like life would be so much easier if you could just drop yourself into somebody's brain and like see exactly what it is that they're like, because sometimes you can't vocalize like the struggle that you have. You can't really explain what it is that's, you know, so difficult. And that's okay. But also it makes it very frustrating. So I can't really explain it, and I don't know. But I had this thought last night about it because of this idea that I came up with, where I was like, you know what? I wouldn't be able to write a book that was just like a romantic comedy set in this time period. I would enjoy that. But I would quite like to capture the vibes of that whilst doing something that's a bit more me. And that is like what I think the whole aim of your sort of career as a writer should be, is that you find ways of doing something that you love, but in a way that feels authentic. And if that means that you have to read other people's work that's completely different to get a grip on what it is that you like in your own writing, then that's what you gotta do. If it's that you like to look at the visuals that other people put forward and that are beautiful and that evoke something in you, but you manipulate them to be more like something that you will enjoy writing about, go for it. And I think that's how you find your voice, is by experimenting, but by experimenting in a way that is encouraging of yourself, not of, you know, the trends that are out there. Because as well, by the time that you've written something and you feel like it's decent, chances are that train's already moved on, you know, way out of the station. Like, you'd have to be a roadrunner to catch up with it. I feel like sometimes it's just so easy to get caught up in yourself and in what you are or are not good enough for, and you start to think, I just sound like I'm copying this person, and maybe you are copying that person, and that's okay. But just try not to be like that. Try to be a bit more fluid with the way that you do things. You know, if something doesn't feel right, it's probably because you're emulating too much of other people. If it feels really difficult to come up with words, maybe it's because you don't know the characters well enough. Maybe you're overthinking it. Maybe you're trying to write something that's perfect first time. All of these things, they really do impact you. And to go just very briefly before I finish, back to the point of like when I'm not myself, that's when my brain is very slow. Because like right now, for example, I feel very stupid right now. Because my brain, like I can feel how heavy it feels in my head, you know? And I had like a headache last night. I'm probably gonna have a headache tonight. I also think that I feel that way when I'm like in a depressive episode. Like I just don't connect to myself in a way that I usually do. And I had a teacher once who was like, this doesn't read like your usual work. And I was like, yeah, I was aware of that. Because I was depressed. And I think that sometimes you just need, as tough as it is, okay, you just need to kind of try and do it, and do it anyway, because you can fix it later. You can rewrite it, and you should be rewriting, I think. I don't think that you should just be going into a first draft and editing, especially if it's your first ever book, because you're gonna be a different writer by the end of it. I might get into that in my editing stage video when I get there. It's gonna be at least 2 months, I think. But I would just advise to be like aware of that stuff, you know, to be aware that it's okay to not sound like yourself, but that there could be a reason for it, and that these are some of the reasons maybe. And that if you're really, really struggling, I would also say that there are a lot of people who have similar sort of content to this, especially on like Instagram. I've seen a bunch of like carousel posts about people being like, and this is how you can try to get your voice. I would recommend reading those, but also again, do it your way. Pick and choose what works. Don't just do everything because somebody says and it might work. Do what feels like it might work for you. And if it doesn't feel like it's working, just ditch it. That is like the main thing. You can't be yourself if you're just following what other people do. And that includes by taking advice, like from me, for example. Transform it. I transform everything that I touch into myself. We actually also did a video about this. Not a video, like a podcast episode, which was my friend and I, my co-host, we wrote the same story prompt, short story prompt, but we did it very differently. Very, very differently. And it was like so different from each other that it was like you would not necessarily have known that it came from the same prompt if we hadn't necessarily said it. And I think that when you think about stuff like that, it's worth knowing that, you know, your voice, sometimes it literally is just in the way that you automatically want to change a popular concept. You could do that, I suppose, as like a sort of exercise. Take like a popular book idea, like the concept of it, you know, like it's like a log line. I don't know if you are in that sort of thing, but like for example, the bell jar, you could say, is like a 19-year-old woman learns how to live with, you know, this like excruciating depression that also forces her sort of perspective to change about like womanhood and like the world around her. as a young woman in it who is like, you know, neglected in many ways and sort of mistreated based off of her being a woman. And you take that and you might get something completely different. You take The Giver of Stars, a book about a woman who becomes a member of a travelling library. You might do that completely different. You might read like Remarkably Bright Creatures and think, oh, a woman and octopus have a friendship, and you might do something completely different. The way that you specifically take on stories and the way that you make them not necessarily the way that the other person made them, regardless of how good they made them, that's not important, okay? Doesn't matter if your idea is like better or not. It matters that that's how you would do it. And so if you're taking a romance and you're thinking that you have to do it like Emily Henry, if you're taking a fantasy and thinking that you have to do it like Robin Hobb or whatever, like, you know, whatever genre you're in, if you're trying to write a story that feels like your influences and it feels stiff and forced, stop trying to make it sound like them. Make it sound like you. And chances are there's an instinct inside of you, like a little tiny voice that's like, maybe we should do this instead, and you've been ignoring it. That is all I have to say. I don't know if this is going to be useful to anybody. I don't know if it's going to be interesting to have heard. I don't know if I'm going to have said anything original. I just think that, you know, your voice is something that you deserve to find, and I hope that you do. I could not imagine not having my voice. I think it's something that I'm pretty happy with, you know? It's not the best in the world. I would never say that, frankly. I think that if you're a writer and you think you're the best in the world, you're probably doing a lot of things very wrong. However, I'm gonna leave that there, and good luck on your journey, but, you know, goodbye.